If you treat history like a massive, centuries-long strategy game, you quickly realize that certain military units didn't just play by the rules, they completely broke them. So today we are tracking the rise and the really dramatic fall of the most devastating, truly overpowered military units humanity has ever seen.
We'll be tracking this evolution through 5 distinct eras: ancient shock and awe, bodyguards and mercenaries, the armored cavalry era, the ranged revolution, and finally, the gunpowder conclusion.
Now, just to be clear on our definition for this explainer, an overpowered unit is basically a force that felt like they were cheating. They dominated their eras so completely that standard armies literally had no answer for them. But, as you'll see, absolutely nothing lasts forever. Every single one of these legendary units eventually met their match, either through some game-changing new technology or a fatal internal flaw that finally just nerfed them right out of existence.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, Ancient Shock and Awe, the earliest meta breakers. 37. Now that isn't just some random number. That is exactly how many of Carthage's terrifying war elephants, the brilliant General Hannibal, marched straight across the freezing Alps in 218 BC. I mean, just imagine being a Roman soldier and facing a literal moving wall of muscle. It was pure shock and awe. The enemy horses would actually panic just from their smell alone. Hannibal used the survivors of that brutal crossing to smash Roman lines and terrorize Italy for 15 years. But their reign did end. Roman commanders eventually figured out their fatal weakness. At the Battle of Zama, the Romans just opened up lanes in their formations. They let the elephants charge right through and used fire and deafening noise to panic the beasts into turning around and trampling their own Carthaginian troops.
Then you have the Scythian horse archers, whose tactical genius relied entirely on pure deception. These guys lived on horseback on the steppes north of the Black Sea, and they could fire up to 12 arrows a minute at a full gallop. And these weren't just standard arrows. They were barbed and, get this, dipped in a horrific mix of snake venom, blood, and dung. Yeah, absolutely brutal. Their signature move was the Parthian shot. It was a simple 3-step dance. Fake a retreat, wait for the enemy to aggressively chase you, and then turn completely backward in the saddle to fire an arrow right into their faces. They wrecked massive empires with this, but their fatal flaw? Settling down. The very moment they tried to hold land and farm, they lost that unmatched mobility, and rival nomads just ground them into dust.
Moving on to Section 2, Bodyguards and Mercenaries, where loyalty only went to the highest bidder.
This era is defined by a classic strength versus weakness narrative. Take the Numidian cavalry, for example. They rode without saddles, without bridles, steering their horses entirely with their knees. This gave them total freedom of movement, which they used to slaughter 50,000 Romans in a single afternoon at Cannae. But their loyalty belonged purely to whoever had the deepest pockets. When they were paid to switch sides, Hannibal instantly lost his best weapon. It's the same story with the elite Praetorian Guard. They had the raw power to make or literally murder Roman emperors, but they were eventually disbanded because they backed the wrong political horse. And the Almogavers? They had this incredible stamina that let them smash French and Turkish cavalry armies. But their sheer greed caused them to turn on their own employers and sack the city of Athens.
But on the flip side of greed, we have units that were destroyed by their own rigid sense of honor. The paladins of Charlemagne were totally legendary for defending truth and championing the weak, but that whole tradition completely faded out when Charlemagne's sons selfishly started fighting each other for the throne. But honestly, the Jomsvikings take the absolute prize for the most fatal code of honor. These elite Viking mercenaries were strictly forbidden from fleeing an equal or stronger enemy. They were banned from even showing fear, which is highly intimidating, right? Well, until the Battle of Hjörungavágr around 986, when defeat became obvious, instead of retreating so they could fight another day, many Jomsvikings simply sat down on the battlefield and waited to be executed. They bled their own brotherhood dry just to satisfy a rulebook.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, the Armored Cavalry era, the original medieval tanks.
Moving iron statues. Honestly, that is exactly how terrified witnesses describe the Goguryeo cataphracts of Korea. Both the rider and the horse were just entirely blanketed in heavy scale armor. Standard arrows literally bounced off them like rain. And China? They pushed this concept even further with the Iron Pagoda cavalry. They would chain their heavily armored horsemen together in tight groups of 3. The idea was, if one horse went down, the other 2 would literally drag the dead weight forward, maintaining this unbreakable, crushing wall. But ironically, that sheer mass was their undoing. Fast, light Mongol horsemen easily ran circles around these chained trios, picking the horses off one by one, until those massive iron walls just violently collapsed under their own cumbersome weight.
Meanwhile, over in Europe, the Norman knights were earning the exact same reputation. I want you to picture a 250-pound man covered head to toe in chainmail, riding a 1,500-pound warhorse that was specially trained to bite, kick, and trample people. They were the ultimate medieval tanks. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, they used incredible discipline to perform these fake retreats, which tricked the English shield wall into breaking formation. Then the knights would quickly turn around and shatter them. The combined weight of a Norman cavalry charge would simply smash right through any infantry line of that era. No question.
But every tank has a weakness, right? Which brings us to Section 4, the ranged revolution, where distance suddenly beat armor.
Just look at the unbelievable disparity here. At the Battle of Sudamore in 1420, you had just 400 Czech Hussite rebels utterly smashing 2,000 elite armored knights. How is that even possible? Well, they built rolling wagon forts. These were basically everyday farm wagons, heavily reinforced with thick wooden planks, firing slits, and chains connecting them into a massive square. Safely protected behind these walls, these peasant rebels just fired hand cannons and crossbows point blank at the charging knights. And when the knights inevitably broke against the wagons, the rebels poured out and finished them off. It completely proved that clever tactics and ranged firepower could humiliate the most elite traditional royalty.
And speaking of firepower, the Genoese crossbowmen had it down to a science with a highly efficient three-man loop. These guys were the absolute best mercenaries money could buy, firing heavy bolts that easily punched right through plate armor. They worked in perfect thirds. One man shot the crossbow, the second reloaded his spare, and the third guy held a massive shield, called a pavis, for all of them to hide behind. It was an incredibly overpowered system. But at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, disaster struck. Impatient French commanders forced them to march into battle without their shields. To make matters worse, a sudden rainstorm ruined their bowstrings, and when they tried to retreat, the angry French knights behind them literally rode over their own mercenaries out of pure spite.
10 to 12. That is the staggering number of aimed arrows a Welsh longbowman could fire every single minute. The Welsh longbow was a beast, 6 feet of solid yew wood with a terrifying draw weight of up to 160 pounds. To put that in perspective, almost no modern person can even pull that back once, let alone 12 times a minute. By massing these archers together, they could pour down something like 50,000 arrows a minute. At Agincourt, they used this devastating rate of fire to shatter French armies 3 times their size, effectively turning those quote-unquote medieval tanks into helpless pincushions stuck in the mud.
But here's the crucial point, and it's a transition that permanently changed the economics of the world. Yes, the longbow was undeniably superior to early firearms, but it took an entire lifetime to train a longbowman. They started at age 7, and it physically deformed their bodies until their left arms were significantly thicker than their right, and their spines literally bent sideways. But a musketeer? You could take a peasant from a farm and train him to fire a musket in just 6 weeks. It's the ultimate historical lesson in scale. Eventually, raw quality loses to massive quantity. Gunpowder became the ultimate equalizer.
Which brings us to our final era, Section 5, the Gunpowder Conclusion, the final nerf.
In this new era, flawless, almost fanatical battlefield discipline became the new overpowered meta. Take the German Landsknechts. They fought in massive blocks of men wielding 18-foot pikes and giant two-handed swords, all while dressing in these wildly bright slashed outfits. Unstoppable in combat, right? Well, until their pay was late. Then they would mutiny, which is exactly what happened when they violently sacked Rome in 1527. Then you have the Swedish Carolinians. These soldiers were drilled into absolute machines. Their main tactic was insane: march straight at the enemy while taking heavy cannon and musket fire, stopping only at a terrifyingly close 50 paces to fire one single volley and then immediately charging in with bayonets. They were fanatically religious, believing God alone decided their time of death, meaning a retreat was a literal insult to heaven. At one point, 10,000 of them destroyed a Russian army of 40,000 in a blinding snowstorm. But eventually, deep in Ukraine, Peter the Great's massive, much better supplied army broke them. It proved that, at the end of the day, sheer logistics will always beat fanaticism.
And that perfectly sets the stage for the Khalsa warriors of the Sikh Empire, truly the ultimate historical blend of ancient warrior vows and modern European tactics. Founded way back in 1699, they trained from childhood with swords, spears, and flintlock muskets. By the early 1800s, they had built a highly modern army that ruled a vast, incredibly powerful territory stretching all the way from Kabul to Tibet. Their reputation was legendary. I mean, it culminated in the historic 1897 stand at Saragardi, where just 21 Sikh soldiers heroically held off 10,000 Afghan tribesmen for hours. But their empire as a whole was ultimately nerfed and broken decades earlier by 1849. And it wasn't superior individual skill that beat them. It was the overwhelming, mechanized, and industrial scale of British East India Company artillery.
So what's the big takeaway here? Military history is essentially this endless repeating cycle of breathtaking innovation followed by inevitable obsolescence. The moment a unit relies just a bit too heavily on its armor, its rigid code of honor, or its paycheck, a new technology or a smarter tactic comes along to wipe it completely off the map. Adaptability always outlasts pure strength. Which leaves us with one really fascinating question to ponder. As we look at the drone swarms and cyber warfare of today, what unseen weakness will eventually bring down the overpowered military units of tomorrow?